Today's presentation is Sealing Pharma Commercialization Deals, Creating Optimal Value for Investors. Next slide, please. Our speakers today are Dr. Fran Brown and Mr. Oliver Leatham. This webinar will be a play in two acts. So in part one, Fran will be talking about the core elements of asset value. Fran is currently a Senior Vice President of Drug Development Services at Certara's Integrated Drug Development Division. She has over 25 years of broad experience within the pharmaceutical development and due diligence and asset evaluation. Part two of the webinar will be presented by Oliver, who will be talking about commercial development and value differentiation. Oliver is currently a Vice President and Global Head of Commercial Strategy and European Union Value and Access at Certara's Evidence, Value and Access Division. He has over 20 years of experience in European market access landscape. Welcome to the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Fran to begin the presentation.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm going to spend the first part of the presentation talking about some of the more general aspects that are important in asset value, and then we'll pass over to Oliver to drill down on one section of these, which is alongside the commercial evaluation. I'm just going to apologize in advance. I've got a cold, so I'm a little husky, and forgive me if I end up coughing during this. Pam, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So on this slide, I've got some of the more general buckets that create value for an asset. And unsurprisingly, the data with the asset itself is really only one component of what investors are looking at when they look for value. And I've grouped the others into areas that I describe as understanding the destination. And those include things like your intellectual property, freedom to operate, what is the opportunity assessment, the landscape that you're working in, and what is the commercial potential that you've evaluated for that landscape. And the other three areas of these are more about how do you as an organization intend to get to that destination? What's your journey and roadmap looking like, and how have you defined it? And I'm going to drill down into these sections a little more in the coming slides, but the team structure, the company is an important aspect of this. The product development plan is critically important, and I'll come back to that later, but also risk identification and mitigation. Next slide, please. So defining the destination, and a lot of this centers around developing a target product profile. And there's a lot of different elements that feed into a target product profile. And the two that are most important are the opportunity assessment and the commercial potential. And the key drivers for these is understanding the mechanism of action, and from that leading into looking at potential indications. And these may be within a therapeutic area, but more and more they may run across multiple different therapeutic areas. And within that setting, then understanding what is the current treatment landscapes for these potential indications, what's the competitive pipeline looking like, what's the unmet medical need, how would the mechanism of action of your compound allow you to differentiate from current treatment and actually provide an additional benefit to patients. And all of those things then run into an evaluation of the commercial potential. And that's driven by the elements of the TPP. And understanding the commercial potential, and Oliver will go into this much more in detail in his section, but there's a lot of things to be considered in that. And one of those is where you want to be in the world. standard of care, treatment paradigms, all of those vary with geography. So understanding your destination and what your end result looks like is extremely important. Next slide, please. So coming to the target product profile for a moment. And what I've got on this slide on the left side is actually an illustration that is using the target product profile template that the FDA has as part of their advice to sponsors. And one thing to note about this is really that this is targeted at getting an initial approval. What it doesn't do is bring in elements that are actually important for the commercialization of a product. And the two elements that are most important in all of those that are listed on this slide, one is the primary indication. And it's important when you think about the primary indication, not just to put the disease. It's actually work out your indication wording and how it is actually going to be reflected in a potential product label. And that then gets paired up with the patient population. And these two elements really help define what your development program is going to look like, because the objective is that it should deliver on those two parts. Sorry, just previous slide again, thank you. The other important thing to note on this is the two columns, and your target product profile really should have a minimal acceptable achievement level. And if you don't achieve this, what you're saying is that then your product becomes non-commercially viable or non-approvable. And then there'll be an upside to that on which will relate to what you think the potential of your compound might be in order to differentiate to existing therapy. On the right-hand side here is some elements that often get added to a target product profile that are more focused around commercial factors. And these include things like cost of goods and target price, but also what is the current gold standard therapy that you're hoping to differentiate to and what you would hope to achieve to be able to show that differentiation. Next slide, please. So coming now to a bit more about mapping out the journey. So from an investor's point of view, it's very important for you to be able to show that you know where you want to go, but also how you plan to get there. And there's three elements to this part. One is the competence of the company itself and the people leading the company. And this may vary in importance depending on whether you're looking for a partnership or whether you're looking to sell an asset. But some of the components that you know are important around these, financial health is one, track record of the management team. Can they show that they've done this before? Do they have expertise in the therapeutic area of interest? What is the commitment of key people within that company? What's the reliance on external partnerships? And this is especially important for small companies, because often then there's a very core staff within the company itself and a lot of external expertise and contract organizations are then used to execute on some of those plannings. And ensuring those services are guaranteed and having plans to mitigate anything that potentially goes wrong is an important factor. The assessment of competence, of course, will vary by the stage of development. And as you start to get towards late stage development, then thinking through what is the launch and commercialization infrastructure and planning looking like becomes much more prominent at late stage development. The core element of developing a compound is the product development plan. It's sometimes surprising that there often isn't one, but being able to show that not only have you thought through the clinical parts of what you want to do, but actually all of the disciplines that feed into a product development plan is very important, and shows that you actually are doing activities now that don't then cause you delays later. So thinking through your CMC development, thinking through your toxicology development, thinking early about biomarkers, companion diagnostics, all of these should be integrated into a product development plan. And the other key element about the journey is risk and risk identification and mitigation. There's no development plan that always goes the way it should. Things happen, and identifying where those might be and what would be the next steps really conveys a level of competence about being able to roll with the punches as you go forward. So there's key questions that need to be addressed at the different development stages, and looking to see whether they have been thought about and planned for is also one element of asset value. Next slide, please. So in the discovery phase, even as early as this, thinking ahead to the destination is important. So understanding and establishing your freedom to operate is driven by where you want to be ultimately. So thinking through potential indications, making sure that you've covered your IP in those areas, developing target product profiles in alignment with those areas, and then thoroughly understanding the target you're working with, the engagement of the molecules you have at that target, and developing the pharmacology to show what that target can do, but also to understand off-target effects. And that's very much the emphasis of the pre-entry into human phase. This is the point where you start doing your safety evaluations, safety pharmacology study, early toxicology studies, all of the ADME work, but also things that people don't often think about is thinking about biomarkers. How are you going to evaluate target engagement? How are you going to look at proof of concept if you don't have easily measurable clinical outcomes? Also at this stage, if there's any intent to use companion diagnostics, this is the point at which you need to start thinking about that. Coming on to later stage, you really don't want to be developing new companion diagnostics once you're into clinical studies. The early clinical phase, and I've boxed this because I think it's probably the most pivotal part of the journey with regard to strategic planning. So at this point, you're starting to learn about the clinical impact of your compounds, what they can achieve, looking at dose response, looking at food effects, other things, evaluating any formulations that you want to think about propagating forward into your pivotal studies. But also you're doing all of the other registration elements of your product development plan at this point. You should be thinking through anything that's needed in the pivotal studies with view to both commercialization. You would also need to have your clinical pharmacology plans laid down, your CMC plans well defined. This is the point at which you need to go and be talking to regulators about what you're planning and is it acceptable, and does it form a path forward, especially if you're working in multiple geographies and you need to try and find one plan that works for everybody. All of this leads into your phase 3 designs, and once you start those phase 3 designs in motion, then you're kind of set on a ship sailing the ocean at that point. The other thing that's often forgotten at this point is thinking about pediatric planning and any obligations that you have to be able to develop the compound in a pediatric setting. Once you're into late clinical, then the important elements is the phase 3 design. And I'm going to come on into a second about all of the competing influences on your phase 3. But also at this point, you're preparing to look forward to commercialization. On the CMC side, you're scaling up and doing all of your supply chain planning. You're starting your commercial planning, looking at sort of launch pricing, contracting, all of the strategic value decisions. And Oliver will discuss those in much more detail in the next section. And then once you file, it's not really a quiet time. The emphasis switches then to all of the commercialization, and the focus becomes on launch and preparations for launch and all of the negotiations with regard to value and reimbursement. Next slide. So understanding all of the different competing drivers that go into your phase 3 design, it's very important, because it always becomes an exercise of trying to optimize what information you can get out of these pivotal studies, both from an approval point of view, but also from a commercial point of view, and balance that with what becomes really burdensome for the patient and the sites. And that's quite a delicate balance. But sometimes what you would do for approval and what you would do for commercialization can pull in two different directions. So from a approval point of view, you're focused on what's acceptable from a regulatory agency point of view. The endpoints that are used for approval are not necessarily the most relevant for clinical use in a treatment setting. They're often influenced by regulatory precedent from prior compounds that have been approved. And thinking through the primary and secondary is very important, as only the primary and key secondary endpoints will ever appear in a label. Other factors that can differ to what might drive commercialization: use of a comparator, the acceptability of placebo, use of an active comparator. All of those can be different by geography, and you need to consider that. Also in phase 3 studies, although the patient population is much greater and more varied than for phase 2, it is still actually fairly restricted compared to what the population would be once the drug's on the market. And this becomes a delicate balance of finding the right level where you're expanding the patient population wide enough, but not creating risk for any particular subgroups that where there may be a concern. On the commercialization side, you're looking at what can you do with regard to supporting your health economic arguments that you're going to be using with the payer organizations and reimbursement discussions. You're looking at patient-reported outcomes, things that matter to patients, and they can also link in with the payer discussions. You're also looking to include endpoints which would allow you to differentiate to key competitors. And you're looking for things that then you can use actually in a publication strategy. So finding which of these are important enough that you can squeeze them into a phase 3 design is a very important discussion, and good to start early. Next slide. So I just wanted to come back to some of the experience that we've gathered over probably the last 3 years and focus on some of the reasons why investors decide not to. And the surprising thing here really is that the intrinsic properties of the compound itself are only rarely the reason for this. And most of the decisions relate around paths that have been taken and the development strategy that has been pursued. And they fall into several different categories. CMC comes up a lot. CMC is very difficult to de-risk later in development. So if you don't start it early, it can also often be a real time delay or a real risk. Development strategy, one of the key things we see is actually people who decide not to follow the advice they've been given by a regulatory agency. And that really sort of sets risk levels that are very high. Sometimes it can work out, but it's a big risk for a company to go that route. I just want to come in the following slides. I'm going to talk through a few case examples where the risk was decided too much to pursue an investment decision. Next slide, please. So this first case study, it was a small molecule. It was being developed in oncology in 2 different tumor indications. It had a long development history. The initial phase 3 studies had been stopped for futility, and substantial side effects had been observed in those phase 3 studies that had required a lot of patients to have their dose reduced during the studies. However, a post-hoc analysis did suggest that there was efficacy in a subset, which could be identified by a tumor diagnostic biomarker. At the point of the evaluation, the onward plans, they were looking to start 2 new phase 3 studies, which would be the basis of an approval, 1 in each of the tumor indications. They were going in with a lower dose than had been used for the prior phase 3, and their plan was to file for a patient subset based on the biomarker. And the key risks identified for this program is the biomarker hadn't been validated prior to going into the pivotal studies. This had been identified by the agencies, and essentially the feedback was that they need to be doing this prior to doing a pivotal study if they wanted to end up with a companion diagnostic driven indication. The other risk was essentially that there was no efficacy at the lower dose that they were planning, and there was a lack of agency support for the proposed study designs. Next slide, please. The second case study is a small molecule that was being developed as an antibacterial. The in vitro data was very good. It showed high specificity and suggested a good differentiation to existing therapy. The company had done a small phase 2 data, but only with a single dose level. And that dose level had been selected based on a comparable analogous products. The data from that study did suggest that there may be the product could provide a valuable treatment option. However, the onward plans, they were planning for 2 identical phase 3 studies with an active control. The primary efficacy parameter was driven to show superiority to the active control, with a secondary analysis on non-inferiority. And the risks identified, one was the fact that there had been no dose ranging done in the program was considered a risk, and this had actually been reflected in some of the feedback from the regulatory agencies. They had selected the primary efficacy parameter to go forward with, and which was not aligned with the advice they had received from the regulatory agencies, nor was it aligned with other compounds that had been developed in the same indication and had already been approved. The other risk was that their primary analysis was aimed at superiority, and if they failed to show that, then they would struggle to actually get approval on a secondary analysis of non-inferiority. The other element that came up in the risk assessment is that they were assuming they would get first-line use in a market setting, and it was unlikely that that would be possible given the planned pricing that they were considering. So there was risks really associated with their whole commercial strategy around that. Next slide. And the last case study I have is, it's a vaccine. It was being assessed at basically at the end of a phase 2. It was a rationally designed antigen selection which had a good scientific basis for it. There was significant unmet need in the area they were targeting, but there was no experience at that point. They were heading into pivotal studies with the planned large-scale CMC process that was going to supply those studies. The other pivotal thing is that the studies they were planning were going to be sourced from multiple different production processes. And the risks identified around this were sort of numerous. They were using a novel adjuvant, and there was some indication that that adjuvant was causing a strong immunogenic reaction independent of the antigen selection for the vaccine. The comparability between the processes that would have sourced their phase 3 program would not have been available until after the studies completed, which pushed all of the risk about the usability of the data until the very end of the program. And added to that, the data from the phase 2 showed mixed results across a large range of the parameters they looked at, and some baseline differences in the groups. And again, comparable to some of the other case studies, the endpoints that were being proposed for the pivotal studies were different to prior approved therapies, and they were not aligned with agency advice. So I hope the 3 case studies sort of allow you to see sort of how important it is, one, to focus on CMC very early in the development, but also to go early and often for agency advice and really work with them as a partner through development. With regard to the importance of commercialization, I'm going to hand you over now to Oliver to talk more about the importance of thinking of things early in the development program.
Thank you very much, Fran. So just to carry on with what Fran's been saying, and I hope everyone can hear me well, as well as regulatory approval for being able to run a good study, but also having a strong clinical program, and I think a strong TPP, which Fran mentioned several times, for your product. We really need to know more about what these studies mean to manufacturers and also to investors in terms of what is their real market potential. Please could you advance the slide, Pam? Thank you. The first step is to understand the opportunity. So what is the burden of disease? What is the unmet need? How will this new product disrupt the current management of patients? And how equipped is the company itself for an effective and well-planned launch? Please advance. This is really a multidisciplinary approach requiring clinical and commercial experts to come together in all aspects of the plan. We need to know how the market is likely to respond, both from a clinical perspective, but also from a payer perspective, the people who are actually going to pay for this treatment. Can we advance again? Optimizing a product's commercial potential requires excellent planning. This involves the creation of a robust launch strategy or a commercial roadmap with key clinical and commercial activities mapped out. The overall aim of this is to optimize the time to launch, but also from launch to peak sales. The more we can move this graph to the left and upwards, the better for organizations to realize their true ROI. We can move on again, one more slide. The key reason to follow each of these activities in turn is to be able to really reduce uncertainty and respond to market challenges, such as understanding the responses from health technology agencies for certain data that might not currently be in a clinical study design. These contingencies add value by demonstrating a manufacturer's ability to find another way to market regardless of that challenge. For example, being able to circumnavigate the difficult requirements of a health technology appraisal body. Again, can we advance? At each stage of the development process, we're identifying, building, and communicating product value. To start with, we need to understand the epidemiology and the unmet needs. Then we need to be able to generate the right evidence and to differentiate our product from what's already on the market. For example, comparative efficacy data. We also need to look at product positioning and market preparedness, and also optimizing launch. How do we do this? Can we identify the patients that are most likely to benefit from the treatment? Do we have advocacy from clinicians and payers? And have we engaged early enough with the right stakeholders, the people who are going to really make those decisions about whether this product gets reimbursed and whether it gets used, to understand whether we are going to get to market quick enough and we are going to be able to impact the market enough to realize the true potential of our product. Please advance. One of the key things to do here is which massively increases our chances, of course, of success, is to engage early with health technology agencies, payers, and other key stakeholders. This ensures, firstly, that our clinical plan meets the requirements of the markets, but also of the agencies that are going to approve our product. It helps us to deal with launch uncertainties, such as surrogate endpoints. And it also allows us to highlight things like the economic impact of our product when it comes to market. We know from past examples that a product that, for example, reduces hospitalization costs or the amount of polypharmacy a patient needs, generally means it's going to reduce costs, and it also means it's going to improve the patient's quality of life. Please advance. Recent case studies demonstrate the importance of this engagement and the value this understanding this launch preparation. For example, in the middle one, in advanced therapies, in acute exacerbation of a chronic disease, in this case, rheumatoid arthritis, we're able to engage early with the health technology agency to agree on the alignment of study design and the duration of that study, and also on the disease management across countries, which varied significantly. The HTAs were able to gain a consensus on what the comparator should be, and we also agreed an extension of the study to meet with these requirements. Finally, the health economic and cost effectiveness models were accepted by all agencies. And this just demonstrates the advantage of being able to understand the market, but also to be able to learn from best practice and what people have done in the past. Please advance again. But despite this, there still remain many challenges. Health systems are not set up to consider rare or curative therapies. There's no real consensus on how to pay for a one-time treatment or how to manage an annual budget allocation for something that might show a benefit over 5 or 10 years. Some therapies, for example, may have much higher upfront costs than ongoing costs. An example of this, and where a product that's also been successful, is Zolgensma, a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy at a cost of 1.9 million in Germany, the highest ever reimbursed price for a therapy. This is an example where they have been able to manage the system and get into the market and get funding for a high priced drug. But this is probably one of very few so far that's been able to navigate some of these health system challenges. Please move on. As well as learning from successes, we must also learn from our past failures. Glybera, for example, for lipoprotein lipase deficiency, is of ultra-orphan indication. It was approved by the EMA, but it was rejected by payers due to its extremely high cost, over €1 million per patient. After 4 years of EMA approval, only one patient received this treatment. Did they do something wrong? Did they not understand the market? Did they get their pricing wrong? Did they not understand the unmet need? Did they not get the data that was required to satisfy the needs of payers and clinicians making those key decisions? Another example is Repatha. This is a bit of a mixed example in hypercholesterolemia. At first, they launched and got HTA approval on a surrogate endpoint, showing that they could reduce low density lipoprotein or LDL-C levels. This was very successful initially in that the product got approval in many markets and the company set some very high return on investment expectations. However, the payer said, so what? What does this mean to us? How are you going to reduce things like myocardial infarction, stroke, or cardiovascular events, things that we can actually measure and quantify? So Repatha went back and they measured these things and they built a real world data study that would allow them to gather this data. They also put together a risk sharing agreement, one of the very first risk sharing agreements in Europe, to show that if they did gather this data and reduce these events, they could massively reduce the cost of the system. In doing so, they gained access, but they missed a lot of time when they could have already been in market and maybe they could already have been profitable with this product. Please advance. So to ensure access, companies must engage early with key decision makers. They must also have a much greater appetite to be able to share the risk, engage in advice from key agencies, but also being able and ready to be ready for post-marketing commitments. This may include things like going to the GBA in Germany, which has said over the last few years, yes, we will approve therapies for gene therapy or rare diseases, but you must come to us with a protocol for real world evidence showing what you're going to collect in market. If there's no comparative efficacy at launch, if you've only got surrogate endpoint data, you must be willing to back your product in the real world, and you must be able to collect that data, and then we will reassess you further down the line. It's not enough just to have a great study. You also have to know how that study is going to affect how it's going to affect patients' lives, their quality of life, and how it's going to change the paradigm for those patients in the real world. So make the system better. And it's not just about money, of course, because if you can improve people's quality of lives, it means they go to hospital less. It means they use less product. And these patients' quality of lives are often greatly improved. Please advance. So over the last few years, 4 innovative contracting models have emerged, some with great success, some with sporadic success, but these are becoming more and more prevalent. Let's go to the second one first, outcomes-based payment models. Something more prevalent these days in the US, but also growing in Europe. Outcomes-based payments means, what are we going to show you in the real world? For example, how many hospitalizations are we going to reduce by bringing this product to market? This was the case with Xolair, for example, in France, a product for the acute exacerbation of asthma, where they worked with a French agency to show how many hospitalizations they could reduce across 700 patients and multiple hospital sites. And they were able to do this. They were able to demonstrate that by using their product, less patients went to hospital, and they were able to maintain a price premium. Indication and combination-based pricing, not so successful. This is where you come to market with a product that may have multiple indications, for example, in immunotherapy, and you want to broaden into other indications. The challenge here is that if you come in with an indication which is not in a rare disease, or it doesn't have a high price to start with, it's very hard to then increase your price for future indications. What we find is that price tends to stay the same, and what often happens for future indications is you have to offer discounts. But this doesn't mean this should be discounted, because the idea is still out there and HTA bodies are still looking at it. Financial-based contracts, often more simple, offer a simple discount. Sometimes offer 3 months free for a product, and then if it works for the patients, the health system continues paying. If the patients fail, they don't have to reimburse the company. And then something that's becoming more and more interesting and quite cool, for example, in markets like the UK, is subscription-based payment models. This has been very successful in a number of areas. For example, in anti-infectives and rheumatoid arthritis, where products have been given a set amount for a number of years by the health system, and in return they give an unlimited amount of their product. So it's a win-win situation. The company just has to be very clear on how they project forward, what that ROI should be, and how they're going to manage this in the future, because this could easily end up with them having to produce more product than is maybe more product than they potentially perceived in their designs. But also it means that the market wins, because you can say all patients can receive this. We're not going to restrict it to anyone. And if you do this very well and you have good predictive modeling simulations, you're able to really benefit the market and benefit the company, and show that you're vested in your product, show you're vested in the outcomes of your product, and you're willing to work with health authorities to make these things happen. If we could move on one more slide, please, again. So there's been a rise in acceptance of these models, as we say, over the last few years. One of the French payers I spoke to recently said the French system was one of the first to start outcomes-based contracting. It did stall for a while with changing governments and changing system, but now it's been rekindled. One of the key reasons is that France is well positioned for these schemes, because it has excellent data availability, covering over 95% of French patients, both in hospitals and in primary care. In the UK, the subscription-based model, as I've already mentioned, is highly sought after, and future indications may require multiple factors to be included in the modeling in order to gain longer-term acceptance and also economic differentiation from the competition. But they're very keen to do this, and NHS England is a body that's very keen to work with manufacturers to do this, and it helps you sometimes to circumnavigate NICE. In Germany, they're saying they'll continuously focus on important medicines, particularly in rare diseases, but only where effects can be measured relatively easily and unambiguously. And that means the absence of things like surrogate endpoints. So you have to be able to put together post-marketing commitments and real-world evidence protocols at launch, which will convince the regulators that you're willing to take some share of this risk. If we could move on again, please. So a couple of examples, recent examples that I'd like to mention is in CAR T therapy, something that's very prevalent right now. Kymriah from Novartis and Viscarta from Gilead, both again UK examples here. First examples of CAR T success. Payers initially rejected these because of the high cost and also the lack of data. NICE also said there were limitations in the data and were not keen to say the product was cost effective. However, the companies were able to also engage alongside NICE with a cancer drug fund, which had its own budgets, with performance-based agreements in place. And subsequently, both were approved in the UK, both by NICE and the CDF. And under the guarantee of collecting additional real-world data, both were able to gain significant access. But they will be assessed at a future point in time in order to determine whether they will retain that price premium based on their performance. Move on one slide, please. Ultimately, manufacturers need to plan and engage early to be innovative with their approach, to develop and communicate value, and be prepared to really put money where their mouth is in order to optimize the chance of success. Stakeholder engagement is absolutely key, and early collaboration with key decision makers here was absolutely vital. One slide, please. So it's really down to manufacturers to, put their money where their mouth is. As I said, to engage early, to be able to communicate value, and to be able to really understand the potential value of their product in the marketplace from very early on in development, and to keep going back and reassessing that value at each phase of the launch cycle. I think if clients do this well, and we learn from our past experience, and we become more open to developing new ways of contracting and bringing products to market, we can all find that we're going to have a lot more success in the future, particularly in places like rare disease and gene therapy. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening today, and look forward to taking any questions you might have.
All right, thank you so much, Oliver. And now we'd like to invite our audience to pose their questions to Oliver and Fran. So Oliver, question for you. You've given us a lot of advice on how companies should attain market access in Europe and Canada, but what about the United States?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, our team is global, and we work with people all around the world. My expertise is mainly in Europe, but yeah, we're finding more and more in the US that are interested in, for example, outcomes-based agreements. It's slightly more difficult in the US because we often find that key opinion leaders, clinicians, and payers value studies that are developed independently of manufacturers, or real world evidence studies that are developed alongside those of manufacturers, so that they get a wide sort of range of opinions in terms of how a product might fit and the value that product might have in the real world. There's also multiple data sources, so it's very hard sometimes to pull that data together, and it often depends on whether you're going for electronic health records or whether you're going for insurance data and so on. So it can be a challenge, but I think they're becoming more aware of this now, and also they're looking at Europe and trying to find different ways to engage, particularly in gene therapies and rare diseases. So I can see that changing very much in the future.
All right, thanks, Oliver. Fran, we've got a couple questions for you. What advice would you give to a new company at the start of their development journey?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. I think putting the additional effort into looking towards the destination would be the biggest advice, is an early evaluation of the potential indication landscape, not just from a point of view of science, but also from a point of view, from the commercial point of view. And as Oliver pointed out, the importance of understanding the payer landscape as well as the approval landscape.
Definitely. Fran, you mentioned CMC as being a problem area for many programs. Can you comment on why that is?
So I think, especially small companies, the hardest part of development is deciding where the limited amount of money can have the best bang for the buck. And in that consideration, some of the CMC preparation work that paves the way for later development often gets delayed. And unfortunately, the CMC costs escalate exponentially as you go through development, and they can be, equally as high as the clinical development costs. And it's very difficult at a late stage to rectify issues that arise in a formulation that you haven't identified early on. So again, coming back to where do you find the most value for the money you spend, making sure that you have a good synthesis, that you understand the starting materials, that you've really put in some legwork to show that your formulation is going to be robust and commercially viable, is actually a very good use of funding early in development.
Excellent. And then Oliver, it looks like we've got a question for you. Why is drug pricing so different between the US and Europe?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And sorry, I think my camera has gone off for a second. But yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's actually something that Donald Trump asked about years ago. I went to a meeting with NICE, IQWiC, HAS, all the European agencies, and the FDA were there. And one of their questions was exactly that. Why are we paying more in the US than the rest of the world? And one person said, why don't I'm back. Why doesn't Europe help fund the drugs system better? I think the question that came back then was, why don't we all look at ways that we can fund these things better? Why don't we all, again, take some share of this risk? I think that's where the question really lies, is how do we spread the cost better, of course, but it's not just about how much we pay for the therapy, it's about the value of those therapies. It's what does it mean to patients long term? What does it mean to health systems long term? And I think that's a question we all have to ask. We have to ask early during the manufacturing process, because sometimes we launch products which actually fail, or we go into phase 3 trials with products we're not quite sure about. So I think that's where I think we can all work together more closely, but also I think the more health systems talk, and there's a lot more integration with EU NETA, for example, in Europe now, around how people sort of harmonize this HTA, or Health Technology Agency process. And the FDA are actually looking at this a little bit more now. And I think we can all, work together to help make this a little bit more manageable in the future. But I think it's often a case of history as well, the way the systems were set up. And also, if you look at the economies of scale, manufacturers are going to go where the prices are higher to start with. So we have to consider, perhaps how do we look at that, and also how do we qualify these things with real world data? And if the data's there, if we understand the subgroups of patients that we're really going for, and the actual number of people we're really going to actually benefit, for example, with being able to use companion diagnostics in oncology to know which patients are actually going to benefit, then you get a better idea of the numbers. And I think that's something we all need to do a little bit better in the future.
Excellent, Oliver. I love that ending on a positive note of that we need to work together and make sure we get these important medications to the patients. Well, I think that this looks like there aren't any more questions from our audience, but I'd like to thank our speakers today, Fran and Oliver, and our audience for those excellent questions. Pam, can you go to the next slide, please? Just wanted to mention that our next webinar in the series will be on April 28th. It'll be on predicting the effect of dulaglutide-mediated gastric emptying delay on drug exposure. And you can register for all webinars by visiting us at certara.com. Next slide, please. On behalf of Certara, I would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. This concludes the webinar. Goodbye and have a great day.